Okay, what I wanted to finish up with in the Russia stuff is that it's important to remember that there isn't just Russia. Um, Marshall does a really good job of sort of portraying the Russian view of the world. And, right now with the Ukraine crisis, we're sort of seeing how this sort of plays out. But it's important to remember that these other countries, especially the ones stayed to the west here, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, probably the most important ones, I'm going to spend a little time talking about Poland. These were all part of the USSR, either directly or they were sort of incorporated in the Warsaw Pact, especially post World War II. So on one hand, a lot of this area had been part of Russia from, say, an earlier period. So, for example, Poland gets partitioned by Germany, Austria, and Russia back in the 1700s, and it gets getting cut apart. For the 400 or 500 years prior to that, Poland, in many cases, actually controlled a lot of what's now considered Western Russia. So there's a lot of bad blood going back centuries in that area. If you're Polish, for example, your view of the Russians is that a group that came in from outside and took you over. So on one hand, the Russians would see, especially like the Russian minority in Poland, they would see this whole area as being part of what should be Russia. Again, that's Putin's argument. If they're ethnically Russian, if they speak Russian, then that area should be ours, which sort of is a stretch anyways. But in that concept, that's the Russian view. And to be honest, I would guess that most Russians actually hold to that. So in that concept, what you have then is these countries, and you have to remember they've been countries, in most cases, post 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Union collapses. But in many cases, they had been countries or part of some other political entity prior to that period. So most of the stuff, most of this area here only becomes part of the Russian sort of satellite area of influence in the period during and after World War II. So for a lot of this area, their view of Russia is defined by the Soviet Union, which of course is the precursor to Russia and was in charge till 1990. So in that context, they don't see, especially because Putin, of course, himself was the head of the KGB in the Soviet Union. So they don't see the current Russian administration as being much more than a new flavor on the old ice cream, if you would. They still see this. They don't see a huge distinction between the Soviet Union and Russia. The military forces look the same. A lot of the equipment's the same. The way they talk is the same. The way they look at the world around them is the same. As Marshall points out, the Russian view of the world really hasn't changed much at all, despite the political changes. And so when this new version of the USSR basically starts talking about reacquiring the boundaries of the Soviet Union as the true Russia, these areas tend to go absolutely nuts. And the best case example would be sort of Poland. First, you have the centuries of struggle between the two areas. World War One, at the end of the German collapse, World War One, and the Russian collapse, Imperial Russia and Germany both fall apart. Poland becomes a country. Of course, in 1939, they lose that when Germany invades them from the west. And most importantly, Russia, i.e. the Soviet Union, invades them from the east. So it's important to remember that Poland wasn't invaded by the Nazis only. Poland was invaded by Stalin at the same time. He had done a deal with the Nazis to split Poland up into two chunks. And of course, less than a year later, the Germans and the Russians go after each other. But that's after Poland's been taken apart. If you talk to the Poles, one of the things that they're wildly aware of is that when the Soviet Union takes over Poland, there's an enormous ethnic cleansing that takes place. The most famous of these is actually, I knew one of the guys that was being sent out there to do work, is called the Katyn, I believe that's how it's pronounced, massacre. The Russians took over somewhere between 25,000 Poles, mainly military officers, but also intellectuals, anyone else they thought wasn't really a good fit for their view of how the world should be, and just shot them in a bunch of ditches in this forest. Ironically, when the Nazis, go after the Soviet Union in 1941, they actually discovered the mass graves and actually make a big political thing about it. And it had huge consequences, at least for the next year, in the way World War II was done between the Polish-British faction and what you might call Western Europe, and the Soviet Polish faction or the Soviet faction in Moscow. The Soviet Union insisted right till the collapse of the Soviet Union that there'd never been any massacre. It was all just a Nazi propaganda move. However, there were bodies being constantly exhumed in that area, and in 1990 they finally admitted that that had actually happened. That over 20,000 guys had been shot in the space of a couple of weeks, just buried in mass graves. There's still a big movement. The Polish government has some money set aside. They have a bunch of forensic anthropologists stuff out there working, trying to exhume the burials, the bodies. They're not burials, and sort of reattach people to their lost loved ones from the 1940 massacre at Katyn. This isn't the only massacre. The Soviet Union was famous for this. So if you're Poland in 2022, 1989, from 1944 on, Poland's part of the Soviet Union as part of the Warsaw Pact. Basically a subsidiary state, very much like in the video you watched on Germany, the way that East Germany was set up by the Soviet Union. So these are all basically almost like states or territories. And Poland was one of those. In 1989, independence finally comes, and they get their independence back as a country for the first time in 300 years. Well, no, they had a little bit in 1918 to 39. So they get their independence back. But in that context, their view is, again, as with most of these areas, the folks that are talking now in 2022 sound and speak and look a lot like the folks that were talking back in 1945 and back in 1750 and all this type of stuff. So the countries that are what we oftentimes call Eastern Europe, which is pretty much the countries that are under Soviet influence until 1989, 1990, have a very usually negative view of Moscow. There's a few exceptions to that, but and the reason is they very cynically and with some justification don't trust Russia in 2022 any more than they trust what happened to them under the Soviet Union back from 1944 through 1989. So when you're looking at these other places, on one hand, yes, they were part of the Soviet Union in most cases. Many of them were actually part of Imperial Russia even earlier. But their relationship with Russia is not of a sort of big brother or something like that, which is the way the Russians think it should be. They very much see themselves as folks that were pretty seriously put upon and taken advantage of, and they really don't want to have anything to do with Russia, no matter what it's called, as long as it still talks and sounds like we should be in charge. So a lot of this current Ukraine crisis, and the reason people are really worried about it is not only just the Ukraine, but the reaction of the states around the Ukraine, Romania, Moldova, Poland, Slovakia, etc., in terms of they don't necessarily see the Ukraine as being the last part of this discussion. They see the Ukraine as being the first part of the discussion, and next year it'll be them. And what you get then is a huge, set of firecrackers, and there's kids playing with matches around. So this is probably the really big concern in the role that Russia is trying to present itself in what used to be Eastern Europe, is its relationships with the areas it still sees as part of what should be part of it. Those folks in those areas, in many cases, do not see the same thing. Yet in almost all those areas, you'll find there's a minority group who are actually ethnic Russians, who were forcibly, in many cases, moved in after World War II to help control these places under the Soviet Union. So you're going to find a minority group that feels like they've been disadvantaged once these places became independent, and they want that relationship. But the majority population, in many cases, it's like, oh, my dead body. So this is why everyone's worried about this powder keg, because no one's sure what's going to set it off or if something will be setting it off. But there's enough historical precedent and bad history that people still remember on a day-to-day basis that it's not prone to easy resolution, which is what everyone's pretty much saying for this area. And that's sort of what we'll sort of come to a screeching halt with all this.